Welcome to the Industrial Control System Information Sharing and Analysis Center's monthly public briefing. We'll take another minute or two to give those who are still logging in a chance to complete the process. During this time, I will provide some housekeeping guidelines. If you are calling in on the phone, you will find a PIN number on the GoToWebinar application. If you would enter this PIN into your phone and press pound, this will allow us to manage background noise. My name is Debbie Wendell, and I will be moderating today's session. I serve as Community Director for the Center and oversee the Center's human-to-human information dissemination mechanisms. In case you are not yet aware of the full range of collaborative products we have to offer, make sure you check out our LinkedIn group, Twitter account, and website blog posts. Plus, we hope that you will take full advantage of these briefings, as well as our Thursday open forum discussion sessions. Our goal is to get our members accurate, timely, and actionable information in a way that best suits their needs. Today's briefing, Establishing Organizational Identity for Shared Situational Awareness, features a panel of distinguished subject matter experts, including Mark Weatherford, principal at the Chertoff Group, and Dr. Fred Cohen, founder of FearlessSecurity.com, a division of management analytics. ICS-ISAC Chair Chris Blask will be facilitating the discussion. During today's presentation, Chris will take the first few minutes to lay out some background information to frame our issue. Then, each panelist will be introduced and have the opportunity to present their opening remarks. Next, the panel will spend about 35 or 40 minutes for their discussion. And finally, there will be time for questions and answers and open discussion at the end of the presentation. At any point during the call, if you would like to ask a question, you may use the hand raise feature in the GoToWebinar application. When speaking, if you would please introduce yourself and indicate your industry affiliation. After the meeting, a recording of this session will be available on the Center's website. So now, without any further delay, Chris, over to you for your background presentation.
Thank you very much, Debbie, and thanks everyone for showing up, both those who are here now and those who are watching this later. As Debbie said, this conversation is about establishing organizational identity, and particularly for shared situational awareness. I'll frame this a little bit for us. With shared situational awareness, what we're talking about is having all of us, by some definition of us, aware of the security and stability and availability of our shared infrastructure. To do this, we have to have facilities who have that awareness. And our two speakers today represent a wealth of experience in that process and methodology and so forth. So it should be an interesting conversation. Where we have facilities who have awareness of themselves and all of that means, then we have the ability to begin to stitch this together so that municipalities, states, nations, and the international community can have an awareness of whether or not we're under attack, whether we're more stable or less stable. And all of this, from a facility perspective, again, starts at home, where we don't have, as is commonly the case today, industrial facilities who have a good situational awareness. There's very little we can do. So it all starts with a simple question: who are you? Do you know who you are, what capabilities you have, what threats you face? So the ICS-ISAC, we're running a program called SARA, acronym which stands for the Situational Awareness Reference Architecture. And SARA breaks down into these four major categories, the first of which is the topic of today's conversation. Again, who you are. Secondly, inventory. Do you know what you have? Are you aware that you have Siemens or Schneider or GE or Emerson or Yokogawa equipment? Do you know how it normally behaves? Do you have the ability to understand how it normally behaves and tell when it changes? And finally, to the point of shared situational awareness, can you share? And again, this is primarily inbound sharing. Can you use information shared with you? And again, if you don't know who you are and what you have, what it's doing, then you probably can't. And if you choose in some relationships with your local government, with partners, with integrators and so forth, can you share some information, and do you know what that information should be? So with identity inside the SARA framework, we look at providing open architectures. So the SARA project will produce an open source guide full of open source tools and practices that anyone can use. Fred Cohen, one of our speakers here today, has developed an architecture and published that publicly, so it's an open architecture that anyone can reference to use to establish their identity. With sharing, we're in the SARA framework, establishing real-time sharing mechanisms so that facilities can get information, bring it down, compare it with their identity, their inventory, their activity, and make use of this, and derive knowledge that may be shareable from that, and share it with those external partners if they choose. So with that, I'd like to throw back to Debbie, who will give the introductions, and we can get the initial statements from Mark and Fred, and take the conversation from there.
As principal at the Chertoff Group, Mark Weatherford advises clients on a broad array of cybersecurity services. As one of the nation's leading experts on cybersecurity, Mark works with organizations around the world to create comprehensive security strategies that can be incorporated into their core business operations and objectives to effectively manage today's global cyber threats. Mark brings a wealth of experience to the Chertoff Group. Most recently, he served as the DHS's first Deputy Undersecretary for Cybersecurity, where he worked with all national critical infrastructure sectors and federal government agencies to develop an understanding of the cyber threat environment, as well as to enhance secure IT network operations. Through his effective leadership, DHS rose to a new level of cybersecurity maturity by greatly expanding its public-private partnerships and fostering efforts to assist private sector organizations in identifying pre-incident vulnerabilities. In addition, he led efforts to expand DHS's ability to share actionable cyber threat information, as well as to build out its capabilities to provide forensics and remediation services. Prior to DHS, Mark held a variety of high-profile positions, including Vice President and Chief Security Officer at the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, where he directed the Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure Protection Program. He was appointed by Governor Schwarzenegger as California's first Chief Information Security Officer and was appointed by 2 successive governors as Colorado's first CISO as well. As Information Assurance Program Manager at Raytheon, he successfully built and directed the Navy Marine Corps Intranet Security Operations Center in San Diego and was Senior Principal System Engineer on the Missile Defense Agency's Missile Defense National Team conducting security certification and accreditation. Mark began his career as a cryptologic officer for the United States Navy, where he led the Navy's Computer Network Defense Operations and the Naval Computer Incident Response Team. He holds the CISSP certification and is a Certified Information Security Manager, and earned a master's degree in Technology and Information Security from the Naval Postgraduate School. His commitment to cybersecurity excellence has earned him numerous awards, including Information Security Magazine's Security 7 Award in 2008, SC Magazine's prestigious CSO of the Year Award in 2010, and GovInfo Security recognized him in both 2012 and 2013 as one of the 10 most influential people in government information security. Chris, back to you.
So Mark, if you want to give us your initial thoughts to start the conversation going, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Chris. And Debbie, if I knew you were going to read that, I would have sent you a one-liner. Boy, now my face is red. But thank you for the introduction, regardless. And so people often ask me. So I've been at the Chertoff Group for about 6 months now. After I left DHS in May, people often ask me what we do. So I wanted to give a very brief description of that, and it'll kind of set the stage, perhaps, for the rest of my comments. So the Chertoff Group, we are really a global security advisory firm, and we do consulting, risk management, and we do mergers and acquisitions advisory services for clients, primarily in the private sector, but we also have some public sector work as well. As I said, we're focused very specifically on the security industry. And the people within the firm, we have decades of leadership experience from the government and financial services and the private sector on advising our clients on how to manage the risk against the broad array of threats, and which is very pertinent, I think, to today's cyber environment. And our headquarters is right here in D.C., but we also have offices in London, New York, and San Francisco. So my work at DHS is actually very applicable to the conversation today, because one of the most important things we did, and my most important role, at least what I felt my most important role at DHS, was working with the 16 critical infrastructures across the nation every day. Without getting into too much detail of the organization of DHS, the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center is really the hub, the focal point for cybersecurity information sharing in the government and between the private sector and the government. The NCIC works with most of the ISACs. Either have a seat on the operations floor at the NCIC, or they have a direct link into the ops floor at the NCIC. And also there are various law enforcement organizations, various other government organizations, and even some private sector organizations primarily from the telecommunications industry. So it really is that hub where information is synthesized and aggregated and then shared back out. So, so again, that's why I think the topic today is so important. So for those of us that have been working in the cybersecurity arena for a while, it's been a struggle to get people's attention. I remember having conversations with CEOs and even my CIOs, 10, 15 years ago, and it was often a challenge to get people to both recognize and acknowledge that that security was something that we needed to pay attention to. I think we've turned that corner. There's enough visibility now on cybersecurity and threats and vulnerabilities associated with it that that in some cases we have more visibility than we want. Now that I'm in the consulting business, as I go out and talk with companies around the world, one of the things that I'm seeing is, and it's one of the ways that I've learned to gauge the importance of cybersecurity in a company is by who seems to be the most aware, concerned, and interested in the issue. And so if that person is the CIO or the CISO or the CSO, then I get a little bit concerned about that, because these are the people that are supposed to understand the challenges and get the problem. On the other hand, if it's a CEO or a member of the board that's coming to me and asking me questions about security, then I realize that they probably have, that there's a little bit more awareness there. So it's that organization probably has a better chance to make things happen. One of the biggest questions that I'm getting today as I talk to boards and CEOs is how do they know if they've done enough cybersecurity diligence? And as anybody that's been in this business, that's kind of a tough thing, because there's a lot of variables there. But I think my advice, my consultation to them, and very broadly, is that they need to think about cybersecurity as simply another risk that a company faces. And doing the appropriate risk assessment work will tell most companies where their biggest risks are and where they need to be thinking about investing. And the alternative to that is the biggest danger, I think, is looking at cybersecurity as an IT problem that's that's purely the responsibility of the CIO or the CISO. So I'm going to toss it back over to you, Chris, and that's kind of just frames out a little bit of my thinking on this, and I'm sure that we'll get a chance to dig into these a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, and no doubt we will have chances to dig into all those things. Debbie, if you want to provide the same sort of introduction for Fred, and Fred, then you can throw into your first roughly 5 minutes and 8.5 seconds of intro. We'll take it from there. Debbie?
With over 40 years of experience, Dr. Fred Cohen is widely considered one of the world's leading authorities in information protection, with a body of work encompassing the breadth and depth of the information security field. Recognized as the person who defined the term computer virus in his graduate thesis, he subsequently went on to create most of the widely used computer virus defense techniques. Fred was the principal analyst who defined the Burton Group Security and Risk Management Strategies reference architecture. In 1977, Fred started a consulting practice focused largely on information protection. Since that time, it has evolved to meet the changing needs of business, government, academia, and individuals as an unbiased and independent source for top-quality information in an ever-expanding range of areas. As times have changed, products and practices have evolved as well. Commercial and nonprofit entities were started, and they in turn changed over time. Today, the all.net website and its affiliated companies of Fred Cohen and Associates, Management Analytics, and FearlessSecurity.com provide in-depth, free content of a quality matching the top 4 free services in the world. They have been and will continue to be dedicated to helping others understand the complex issues of information protection in the simplest, most straightforward, and most accurate terms possible. His commitment to information protection, coupled with his in-depth understanding of the challenges that organizations face, have allowed him to build the successful enterprise that exists today. As a consultant and analyst, Fred has advised hundreds of the world's largest enterprises. Working with the U.S. federal government, he was the principal investigator on studies in defensive information operations, a principal investigator on national information security technical baselines, and founded the College Cyber Defenders program at Sandia National Labs that ultimately led to the formation of the Cyber Corps program. He has worked with law enforcement to improve capabilities to fight computer crime, to identify emerging threats to national security, to advance issues of digital forensics, and to provide subject matter expert testimony in federal, state, and local criminal and civil matters. He was named Techno Security Industry Professional of the Year in 2002, and in 2009, ABC News identified him as Most Famous Hacker, or more accurately, Security Researcher. Fred has authored more than 200 scientific and management research articles, has written a monthly column for Network Security magazine for over 6 years, and has authored several widely read books. Chris, back to you.
Fred, with that short introduction, which is about as short as we can get yours, the floor is yours.
Okay, Debbie, we need to work on your brevity. So many different things there. Don't believe anything she says. So just some brief overview here. What you see on the screen is the picture of the all.net website if you click on protection, and we'll be talking about that in a few minutes. But I basically run Fred Cohen and Associates, which does federal research. We split off management analytics a couple of years ago because of the paperwork and related issues associated with doing both private business and federal business. So that's management analytics. And then we recently created Fearless Security because I was getting very unhappy with people selling fear instead of rational protection decisions. And then I also work with Webster University in their programs in cybersecurity. I got involved with Chris's effort to create SARA, the Situational Awareness program, in particular in the Who Am I arena, because we've been doing this for many years, helping companies and organizations of all sorts understand themselves and be able to apply that to making better protection decisions. And in the context of information sharing, one of the things that we sort of noticed is it's fundamental if you don't know what the other person is, what the other organization is, what it means, then the information is often useless. I mean, so somebody says, we got some set of datagrams coming into our facility that caused this kind of device to stop accepting control signals, and that caused a physical consequence in our environment. As interesting as that may be, it tells you almost nothing about what you should be doing. And so the problem is you need the context of their environment in order to understand in a meaningful way the information they're sharing with you. And so as part of the SARA effort, we tried to help build the capacity to define and identify that, and then you can decide whether and to what extent you want to share the information that you've gathered about who you are with others and make what you share with them more meaningful. Or in the other side, the vast majority of people participating are presumably listening to what others say but not sharing information of their own, and that's perfectly fine. That's in keeping with the approach of the ISAC. But in order to understand it, you really need to have some understanding of yourself. So this context that you see is the overarching structure of our view of information protection. And if you look over on the left-hand side, you'll see standards of practice. And the standards of practice area has enterprise protection, which we've been doing for, well, since the 1970s. So it's a very well-developed and structured approach to understanding the issues of enterprise information protection. It takes the as-is state and identifies a reasonable and prudent future state for some typically strategic time frame. It'll also come across tactical and very urgent needs, and of course you can address those as needed. We then, a little bit more than a year ago, developed an industrial control systems variation on this, actually over a period of years. And you can see that under ICS security in the standards of practice. And if you click there, Chris, that's fine. Then down at the bottom of the screen, you'll see, if it ever shows up, there you go, a list of different elements of the standard of practice. And if you just scroll down in the bottom, Chris, just in the bottom part of the window, if you just scroll down, you'll see a list of somewhere over 100 different elements of the standard of practice. And what you can see, for example, is in the overarching arena, you'll have maturity, the maturity of your program. And if you're a low maturity, for example, later on, you'll find out that you really can't do public key cryptography. You need a higher level of sophistication to do it. And so this sets the context for understanding the set of alternatives that you have, the basis for deciding which alternative you should reasonably exercise in your situation, and then there's detailing about why each of the selections makes more or less sense. And then these days we're working on an early draft of the standard of practice for archives. This is for information repositories, national archives, other sorts of governmental archives, and also systems of records. And so we're working with the Inter-Pares Trust project on this, which is several hundred researchers from around the world. And in fact, I'm here today in wherever, Belgium, for meetings related to that project and the international community. So this gets you a sense of sort of the background of what we're trying to do. This is all open source, by the way. So we welcome anybody that wants. They can come along, apply this. You can click on any of the areas of the diagram, and in the bottom half of the window, it'll pop up a description of what it is we're talking about. And so hopefully with this as context, we'll be able to talk about the use of situation awareness, and in particular the context issues of who am I in the framework of building the sharing of information between people that operate industrial control systems. And Chris, back to you.
Thank you very much. So at this point, the attendees can punch in questions and click the raise hand button to do those sorts of things if they want to get involved. We can take you off mute. You're all on mute presently. But thank you both for that. So I can't agree more, frankly, with what you both said. As another person who's been at this for an awful long time, I as well. And I've quite often been that vendor, selling firewalls because, heck, people are buying firewalls. But when we compare the strengths and weaknesses of the information security market and the industrial space, quite often a lot of us primarily come from an information security background. And we like to believe that we've quite matured over the years. But in many ways, it's really the opposite. And here's where we have opportunities to do things better. Quite often in the ICS space, we find that there's structures in place. There's industrial standards of practice. There's professional standards of practice that are extremely well developed, that have been developing for decades, and in fact, in many cases, centuries. And situational awareness inside the industrial process is very high. It's hard to find a competent facility that doesn't know exactly what their pressures and temperatures and RPMs and voltages and so on and so forth are. So this area of identity may be one of those areas that in information security has been really underserviced. We have still, despite the fact that 20 or in some of our cases 40 years later, sure, there are more people doing information security, but we're mostly doing these tactical things. Doing the assessments is the kind of things that organizations like Fred and his team, like Mark and his team, like very large services companies like PwC and CSC and others have been doing for very large organizations only in the enterprise space. And it seems that if we're all correct here, that we're at the crux, we're at the evolutionary crux of taking our combined infrastructure from a point of zero visibility, zero situational awareness, to enough to actually protect us in the period of time we have, which is very short. So there may be lessons we can learn from the industrial space, and who knows, maybe even map back into the enterprise space. So it's with that, I'd like to start some of the conversations with some general questions that are on my mind for you guys, and see where it goes from there. So it's we spend a lot of time talking about the evolutionary process, the curve, where we are in time, where we've been coming from with all of these components and where we're going forward. I'd like to get your thoughts on the identity portion of it. In your experiences, Mark, we can start with you. Given that you've been at this for a long time, you started it with a military background, you've done this at the state level, you've done this at the national level, you've done this inside the federal government, now you're doing it with an elite group of clients and organizations. In this time, have you seen clients in the Chertoff Group context, or have you seen facilities and organizations get better at this? You touched on some in your initial comments, and you thrown out a comment as well, perhaps too much visibility. So could you share some of your thoughts about whether enterprises are getting better at this, whether they're more ready when you walk in? Do they have more in front of them, or exactly where have we gotten to in time?
So I think it's still a bit of a mixed bag. I will say those industries, those sectors that are regulated in some way are probably a little bit. They think about security more than sectors that aren't regulated. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always better prepared, but there's a lot of reasons for that, as we all know. But I will say, as I said in my opening remarks, I am seeing a trend now where, CEOs and board members actually call me on the phone and say, I just haven't quite figured out. I know this is important. I see it in the newspaper every day. There's these big breaches that are going on. I read about bad guys. I'm not sure that we are doing enough. And then on the other hand, I was just talking with a friend who's a CISO for a very large multinational corporation. He can't get even his CIO to pay more than cursory lip service to security. So I think it's still it's a bit of a mixed bag. I can speak with most clarity about the electricity business because I just came out of NERC a couple of years ago, and I will tell you, and some of the people on the call here who are from the electricity business may disagree with me on this, but in general, most companies, at least the larger ones, get it. And they're trying to figure out how to spend money on it, and how to justify spending money on it. Most large utility companies, anyway, they have created a security structure within their companies. They have a CISO, or at least somebody in charge of security. That is not always the case in some of the other sectors and some of the other industries. that perhaps because they've not publicly seen or they've not publicly acknowledged that they've had security problems, so they really haven't had to feel like they've had to invest in it yet. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag.
Yes. Yeah, I appreciate that, and I agree. Frankly, it's inside some of the things you'd said, there are signs of hope, and there are some artifacts that should worry us as well. The facilities. With all, go ahead.
Can I? Yeah, I just thought of one other thing. So, I hadn't really intended to talk about government-related stuff, but I'm going to now just because I think it makes sense. The president signed the Executive Order 13636 in February to do, among other things, create better avenues for information sharing between the government and the private sector, but also to create this framework of guidelines of due care. And interestingly enough, I'm starting to hear people talk about that I would have never thought would even be aware of it. So companies that in sectors that you wouldn't typically think of as being as engaged in the technology of securing your organizations are now asking about what's the effect of this executive order going to have on our industry or on our sector. So, and quite frankly, when we started working on the executive order last summer, before I left DHS, we knew that this was not going to answer all the questions. It wasn't going to be a panacea for everything security related, but personally, my hope was that if this one issue raised the dialogue, that it would have been well worthwhile. And so I'm actually a little bit encouraged by some of the conversations that are coming out of the discussions on developing a framework. Now, you can criticize the framework or not, and I know a lot of people do, but the fact that it's raising the dialogue, raising the conversation, I think is been a pretty positive effect of it.
Yeah, I agree, and we say that sort of thing an awful lot. And we've heard the same thing from people in the White House that we're working with you to develop the executive order. And this is the nature of these sorts of things. It's you're the president, you're the CEO, you're the respected subject matter expert. You say something in public and moving forward, it can get a lot of criticism. But the fact that an organization like the U.S. administration chose to take that step at about that point in time speaks a lot about the times we're in. Mm-hmm. And Jonathan Stanford at PwC, he and I were having a conversation on this in Dallas a number of months ago, and very insightfully differently said many of the same things. And I couldn't agree more. It's each of us with whatever positions we have in this, those may be relatively visible inside our own communities. We're not that visible to the entire nation, the entire world. The best thing to come out of that executive order is that conversation. I was trying to think, as you're saying, I was trying to think of a positive analogy, but perhaps best just use the one that popped in my mind. It's like we've been tunneling, with shovels individually and in little groups and so forth. But there's a collapsing going on. The topic has pervasively seeped into the entire infrastructure, so that people we'd never thought of, as you said, people we weren't reaching out to, we didn't really think that they'd be paying attention, but they have.
Right. Yep.
And this is a great, wonderful thing, because there are not enough of us. We'll never be able to all go out there individually and have one-on-one conversations to convince everybody in any sort of human timescale. If we're all correct that all this has to be done, then at some point, if you're the CEO of manufacturing ABC, this will cross your plate, and it's happening.
Yes.
So I think that the efforts like Sarah, we're a, as you know, and most of the folks who I know who are online right now know that the ICS-ISAC is a relatively new organization. We're not huge. We don't have, godlike powers and whatnot, and Sarah's not meant to solve all the world's problems. But when you can plant a seed and get people to start doing things and start thinking about things, give them the opportunity to do things that they already want to do, and the situation is right, the time is actually right. And I think now it is in much the same way as it wasn't 5 years ago. We could all shout it from the rooftops, in 2008, and it wouldn't have changed much of anything.
Yep, you're right.
So, Fred, same sort of question to you. So you've had a long, distinguished career, as Debbie said, at great length. You've seen this from a million different angles. Do you see things getting better or worse in the issue of organizational identity, and in any interesting ways that are worth sharing?
Well, I think that most high-level executives are predominantly rational decision makers. I don't think they do crazy things, but you need to understand, some do, but it's fairly rare, and they don't last very long in business if they do really irrational business decisions. What happens is, they don't get the best information. They don't necessarily seek out the best information. Historically, the people that have tried to explain information protection issues to them have not, let's say, understood it from their perspective as an executive. So the more successful CISOs at getting things done are CISOs that understand management decision making. In fact, in many cases, seemingly more so than they understand the technical issues. Although most of the sort of high quality executives in the space that I've met actually understand the technical issues quite well. Although many of the technical people don't quite get it that they do. So I think what you're starting to see is that it's hitting more people's plates. It's executives respond to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and these sorts of things. And certainly when the president says something, he's a chief executive, and if it's important enough for him to mention it, it's important enough for them to consider it at least. But they still need to make good decisions. And so, this is part of the fear cycle that I talk about. A lot of what you see in the media is fear. It's bad things happen, bad things happen, bad things happen. Be afraid, be afraid, be afraid. But it doesn't tell you what to do. So you ask within your organization, or you have meetings with somebody like, the Chertoff Group, and you try to understand enough to make rational decisions. But unless you get to the point where you have an actual decision to make between some fixed set of alternatives and a reasonable basis to make that decision one way or the other, it's really hard to proceed. And if you just look at the fact of history, companies that invest less in information security have tended to prosper, and there's a very good reason why. So you talk about for many years people talked about Microsoft as being really bad in the security space. That's not necessarily as true anymore, but they prospered, and the security people said, we don't understand why. But the answer is simple. They were better at marketing. They ran faster than everybody else. They came out with more stuff. They had a great presence in the market, and so they sold more. And what happens is when you sell more, you make more money, and you're able to sell more, advertise more, build more, go into more markets, and so it's a positive feedback loop. And a competitor who spent more money on information protection and less money on these other things was out-competed step after step after step. And unless the security event knocks you out, or the response to the security event is so expensive that it undoes all that other stuff you've been doing, that response of spending more money up front on security is not a rational one from a business standpoint. So what happens in the sequential strategy game of business, the company that invests less does better over the long run on average. Of the survivors, the couple that didn't invest in security and are big survivors then buy the ones that invest in security, and now they're no longer survivors either. So these rational decision makers are faced with this information that's kind of nebulous in terms of why this notion of of due diligence hits them in a rational way is because they all want to be reasonable and prudent. They have a legal obligation from a liability standpoint to be reasonable and prudent in their decision making. And when you give them something that allows them to lean on it as reasonable and prudent, then they can, assuming that it's something that's sufficiently broad as a community standard, if they do it, then they've reduced all of that severe end of liability. They're not grossly negligent in any case if they start to do that community standard thing. So this is one of the things that moves the ball. So I think that it's rational decision making, and that the objective is to get the rationale for good decisions to the decision makers, and they'll make better decisions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Please go ahead, Mark.
I just wanted to, Fred hit on, I think the whole point he was making there was so absolutely important. And I talk to clients about this issue all the time, and that is, why would I invest, $1 million, $10 million, $100 million in new infrastructure when my competition is not, and there's nothing that's driving us to do that? And so that's actually one of the arguments. I'm not saying it's my argument, but it is one of the arguments for more universal regulation, is that it kind of levels the playing field and forces everybody to float their boat a little bit higher. I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's one of the things that I hear from time to time.
Yeah, that we'll get to the regulation issue in a minute. I agree. It's, I personally, I think that anybody who has a hard and fast position on that isn't thinking about it enough. Is it good or is it bad? Gosh, it's really hard to say. But to the rational decision-making point, I myself have been there, and I say this quite often to the vendors in the infrastructure space. I get it. As a little startup in the early 90s, I couldn't put any effort at all into the industrial space and stay alive. My competitors weren't, and it was neck and neck.
Right.
Yeah. And at Cisco, it was the exact same thing. Sure, all the resources in the world, I couldn't put a single engineer on adding security to the Cisco firewalls for ICS. So, when we look at the vendors in the space and say, gosh, you should have been spending more on security, get inside there, make rational business decisions. And we had a question, Fred, during your talk, ironically enough, from our own Prudence, that we all know. And Prudence, if you'd like to get on the audio, just send a ping and we'll unmute you. But it speaks to exactly these questions. I'll just read it verbatim. As part of their work with their clients, do they undertake a business case analysis that would provide revenue enhancement justification for capital investments in security? So
the simple answer is yes. So it's a little bit more complex than that, but one of the folks that has worked with us as a consultant for many years is John Guinazzo, and he was for a while the CISO at a number of very large enterprises. And one of the things he was very proud of in his career was trying to always identify protection as something to help the top line. That is, something to bring more income. So as an example, he was at a big electronics firm. And so part of what they were doing was ending up buying these very expensive firewalls. Sorry, Chris, for the bad news to your company if you were still in that space. And so one of the things they decided to do was to build their own micro firewalls and use them. And so it turns out for a couple $1 million you can do the necessary stuff to engineer, if you're in the microprocessor business, engineer yourself a pretty darn good firewall and implement it, and then you can start selling them. And it costs a couple $1 million a year to run a set of firewalls for a big multinational, more than that. So in their case, not only was it saving them money over maybe a 7 to 10 year time frame in those terms, but it was generating business for them, and they ended up putting these in chips inside products that they sold and inside things they sold to other companies. So there certainly are instances where there's a business case to be made of turning a profitable enterprise out of deciding to invest in protection. The other side of that coin is that, sort of the many facets of information protection include a lot of process. And the fact of the matter is, process is cost. You know, it's things that you have to do to keep track of stuff. And so, you know, we think of HR, you know, as a necessary cost. I mean, I don't know of an HR department that turns a profit, so to speak. On the other hand, a good HR department brings you new employees that are better than an HR department that's not as good. And a good HR department eliminates a lot of the problems that you would have in liability. And a good HR problem tracks a lot of the things that are going on and helps to devise ways to improve the way your people do their jobs. So it has a benefit, but it's not something that you can typically measure. That is to say, the metrics of the enterprise don't measure it. And people that have tried to measure security, there are some fairly large companies that have tried to do some sort of small-scale measurement of security, and what they find is that the cost of measuring the program far exceeds you know, the amount of money that they could justify for doing that level of measurement. So this sort of relates to another problem. If you're going to claim that it's profitable, you need to have some way to measure what you've invested and what you've come back with. And if you look at how protection's infused into day-to-day activities that people undertake, if you really have to track every time somebody types a password as a cost, it just gets too difficult to do. So even tracking it is too expensive to justify. So I don't think you can do it for everything, but you can do it for some things, and you should. It's reasonable.
So this is Mark now. I want to talk about that really quickly, the justification for measuring things. And, you know, there's been this concept of continuous monitoring floating around for a couple of years. And the federal government, in fact, we started a enterprise-wide program out of DHS to create a we called it Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program that actually will, if you think about it in concept, what it is a program to put the policies, procedures, and technology in place to give you continuous visibility into your infrastructure. So now you actually have the ability to, and by the way, they're still in the infancy stages of this program, but it's going to give, I think it's going to provide in the long run some of this cost-benefit analysis, because you'll be able to see, hopefully, you know, fairly quickly and almost real time when you have security issues, when devices go out of compliance. And I think you can begin to start measuring that and determining the value of that in true dollars. When you can see something that's wrong, identify it, mitigate it, and get a device back in service, or get an operation or a system back in service very quickly, you can put a dollar figure on that.
Very well said for both of us. Go ahead, Fred.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of continue on that theme, because I think it's important to understand that there are no generic solutions here.
Yep.
So one of the notions that we've undertaken is that you shouldn't be measuring things if you're not going to be making decisions based on it. And so we try to measure things necessary to make decisions, and what we find out is that there's far less stuff to measure when you're directed towards making a decision than when you're just out there measuring stuff to measure it, and then trying to figure out how to make a decision as a result. At the same time, if you look at things like workflow systems, which are sort of fundamental to process in business, you know, you need really, for any substantial organization, to have a workflow system that manages your protection process, all the things that the people do, all the permissions that are granted, all the process, and so forth. Well, if you're running a workflow system, it's really pretty inexpensive to measure things about the workflow system. And you can, you know, by measuring the workflow system, you can get useful information towards, you know, continuous process improvement is one of the phrases that you hear applied to this. So there's this balance of measuring the things that are easy and convenient to measure, and you know, that sort of makes it less expensive to measure those things. But at the same time, you really have to figure out the decisions you have to make and direct measurements that are going to cost you something towards making those decisions if you want an efficient, process.
Yeah, and this, I pulled up my favorite set of slides from a dozen years ago, and I'm often asked enough about that period. We sold a lot of security product. How did you do that? What was the message? And the message really comes down to this. These set of slides were created by a friend of mine, Stu Phillips, for training the Cisco sales channel. And this is really exactly the point that Prudence asked about and we're all talking about here. So I've kept these slides and shared them constantly ever since. So your customer's goal is not to buy a firewall. Their job is to be profitable, to be competitive, to do those sorts of things. So we can look at, standards. We can look at forcing people. That may be necessary in some cases, but where we can convince them accurately, where it's actually true, that as in this example, this is how we sold a lot of VPNs back in the late 90s, early 2000s, by mapping that to business productivity. So as often as possible, the only way we're going to avoid forcing compliance and forcing regulations down to any extent is by mapping the need to be secure to the need to continue to exist as a corporate entity. So with that, I'd like to turn the conversation a bit to standards and regulations and compliance and so forth. We've touched on already in this conversation. Mark, certainly you've had extensive experience with NERC in the electric sector. There's all the conversation today, conversation, concern, outright fear, and panic about coming standards and the hand of Big Brother coming down. So to give you a starting point, you can take this anywhere you'd like. Do you think that the NERC standards have increased security with all of the compliance rather than security talk in the electric space? Do you see more coming down the road, and do you see ways to make this better or worse for the rest of us?
Boy, yeah, there are going to be some people out there that are going to hate me, and some people are going to love me. So do I think that the standards have increased security? Yes. And, maybe not for the reasons that people would like to think are most obvious. I think it goes back to what I was talking about for the executive order. Because the SIP standards have become so visible, it has forced companies to acknowledge security. Now, that's not to say that they're not trying to figure out, okay, how can we do the bare minimum to be in compliance, because there are certainly companies out there that are doing that. But my point is that I think it has raised the conversation in the electricity industry that they have to be paying attention to this. I've been to a number of board meetings with NERC, and where all of the registered entities are in attendance, and security is one of the most. Previously there was a reliability and marketing, and there were all of the other things that that the electricity industry concerned themselves with consumed the conversation. But not one of these meetings goes by now where the biggest issue is not cybersecurity and the threats to the industry. And I can say that same thing across multiple different sectors now. You go to an annual board meeting, and security is one of the #1 conversations. Right now, and there's been, when the SIP standards were introduced back in 2000, I always get this wrong, it's either 2007 or 2008. I think it was 2008. When the SIP standards were initially introduced, they were not very good. I mean, you can haggle and argue about it, but they weren't very good. But they've gotten to the place now. SIP version 5 is everyone's expecting it to be released by FERC before the end of the year. SIP version 5 has evolved over these last 6 years to a point where, I think the electricity industry can be pretty dang proud of where they are. Now, is it gonna make security better? I think in many organizations it is. In some organizations, they're still going to be focused on compliance, though, and hopefully SIP 5 will help them transition to that, get out of the compliance mindset and make the leap into the security mindset. It's probably not going to it's not going to happen completely, but I think that's going to continue to evolve.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I see these things in the same sort of frame as frankly everything. Well, as we talked about for the president's executive order, there is no silver bullet. We're not going to solve this with any given artifact or item or anything. However, it's in conversation, particularly when I'm trying to explain what I do for a living with friends and family and everybody else, there's a common understanding that if you're going to provide critical services that other people need to actually stay alive, you should be taught to get on the ride. And you can do that voluntarily, but if you don't do that, at some point we're going to have to make you. But
yeah,
Fred, go ahead, Mark.
That's a really good point. And I think so. Just to set the playing field, I am a capitalist, non-regulatory, keep the government out of my life kind of a guy. But I think that there are certain things that have become so critical to the safety and security of our society that that there is a role for regulation, there is a role for government in some of these things to ensure that people will do the right thing, because it's been proven over and over that unless there's some kind of incentive, whether it's a negative incentive or a positive incentive, for companies to spend money on things that don't provide any real value back to them, they're probably not going to spend that money.
Well, and there's a certain amount of level playing field. Some of your earlier comments, I forget exactly what they were, but they mapped to my experience, talking to integrators, and particularly the ones who really understand security. And they'll say, look, I can't do it. I can't spend the time and money to make my system secure for airfield systems and important things because my competitors don't. And
right.
Until someone says, all of you have to, none of us can. And I think that, without, we live in a political environment, of course, but I think that most of us really are in that middle space, somewhere between, left and right, where we want as much freedom as possible. It's certainly what makes this country, fantastic. At the same time, if you're going to take, the security of your systems and provide power to old folks at home with medical equipment, if you're going to take that cavalierly, it's hard to argue that the market should work this out by letting grandma die. But with that sort of over-the-top melodrama, Brad.
The market does work this out, but in that case, it'll work it out by killing the old people at home. The issue, I think, is...
I'm glad you guys are saying that. We're going to get hate mail, you know that.
Oh, I'm not.
Sure.
I think standards never really forced anybody to be secure, and that security was never really achieved by following the standards. On the other hand, I think Mark had something really right there when he said, as you push on these standards more and more, and people are forced to go look at this again and again and again, eventually maybe they'll get tired of this foolishness of chasing after the standards and decide to learn about what the field is and put the resources in necessary to do the job well. And my experience is that if you're doing the job well, the standards are almost unnoticeable. So companies that do a good job of protection, the next version of the standard comes out, they go look at the standard and they say, oh yeah, well we meet there's this one thing over here which we don't quite meet. But that'll be an easy enough change. We can do this. It won't actually negatively affect our security. It probably won't positively affect it, but we can meet that standard. So people that are doing a good job don't have any problem meeting the standard. people that are just sort of meeting the standard because they have to keep getting pushed by these standards and pushed around, and they get unhappy, and eventually, they decide one way or the other. I do want to emphasize something else about the standards, actually two things. One of them is that in most cases the standards are, I'll say, not very helpful. They sort of tell you must do something, but they don't really give you any guidance on how to do that. And so for people that know what they're doing, it's not a problem. They'll say, oh, I'll do it this way, no problem. But if you look especially in the electric sector and the water sector is very similar, there are a very large number of very small utilities. So, if you're one of the, several thousand little utilities that has one information technology person that, does all of the information technology for the, however many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of square miles covered, by something in the middle of Texas somewhere or wherever. And now they're imposing, a 250-page standard on you. Not only don't you know particularly what it's talking about or care what it's talking about, you just don't have the time to do it. So I just think that there are issues that need to be reasonably addressed in terms of supporting people's capacity to perform. And part of it is, the vendor side, right? So that the vendors should, especially for the small companies, just sort of have stuff that takes care of most of it. And they don't, right? Because it's not mature. The standards keep changing. The vendors are competitive, and they can't, just go out and build this stuff and hope that their customers will come. But I think that as the evolution settles out, as we sort of come to understand the new realities that we're living in, that this is going to ease off, and it's not going to be such a difficult thing to meet the standards. The technology will support it. The process and the process automation will support it. The education and training process will support it. And you'll get to the point where it's just not hard to do. And in fact, right now, it's not that hard to do for the big companies anyway.
I agree. Good point.
And that's there's two segues in that. One, this is your point about the small facilities, and this is a very iterative point in my conversations that what we've done is we've gathered 12 or maybe 120 or whatever organizations and said, okay, we'll work with you. But water is a perfect example. There are 50 to 100,000 water systems, depending on how you count them, in the U.S. The vast majority of them have no capability whatsoever. And one of the reasons for the SARA initiative, we get asked quite a lot, is this a set of standards and so forth? It's like, no. What it's really is here's what you can do. You at least do this. You can be taught on the ride for free, or with very little resources, or here's some specific things you can do. And does that map to the NIST framework? Well, of course it does. And Fred, you had sort of touched on that. If we know what we're talking about, then whatever the standard is, it should reflect in that. We've seen this same in the finance space with PCI. You should have a firewall. It's like, well, yes. And if you know what you're doing, you probably should. But there isn't a lot of guidance for people with very little resources, with very little expertise on what specifically to do. And but the scalability issue of all this as well. One of the questions I want to throw out for thoughts for both you guys is just that. How do we take, in the identity conversation is a good framework for that. We've done identity establishment by taking 2 or 3 or 6 of the very best people in the world and $500,000 and sending them to one of the top 10 organizations in their segment and spending 6 months. But with 6,000 and more power, 100,000 water, and so on across sectors, I'd like to get your thoughts and commentary both on how we scale this, how we get enough understanding at all of these facilities so that they even know where to start.
So I want to start on that one if you can, Chris. So one of the ideas of the standard of practice and the methodology we put behind it was that this allows us to scale from those $250,000 6-month jobs to $25,000 10-day jobs. So it's a factor of 10 reduction in cost. It's a factor of 10 reduction in the amount of time to do it. And so we think that that's a pretty good trade-off point. And I don't see any way to get to larger scale and keep reasonable quality up in the broad sense. but there is an approach that can take you the step further, and that's if you have groups of similar organizations that undertake a group exercise. So in essence, you could take 100 water facilities that are similar in terms of size and shape and so forth, and do sort of 10 assessments, and then have the group meet and work for a little bit, and over a period of maybe 3 to 6 months, come up with a conclusion that says, for all of us, this design pattern will work, and then provide that very inexpensively to everybody else with that design pattern. So one of the things you have is these organizations like NRECA, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, that if they wanted to get behind it, could do maybe 5 or 10 templates to represent their membership, spend the couple $100,000 per template, and then provide it to their membership, so that their membership would have a sort of a typical set of scenarios, a set of alternatives. If you're this size, if this is your circumstance, do this. And effectively then, it would cost very little for each of these several thousand organizations. In the water sector, you could do it even more efficiently because there's sort of less variety in the water sector, and there are more of the smaller water sectors. So you could scale it very, very well, but somebody has to make that upfront investment. So the best we've been able to do is a factor of 10 in cost and a factor of 10 in time reduction to get your answers. And I think you can get another order of magnitude out of that by having groups organized to do this together. And we've suggested it and proposed it to groups, but we haven't been successful in convincing any of them to do that. So that's the approach that I think is the best shot we have right now.
So I want to talk about the scaling issue as well, and maybe approach it from a different perspective. I gave a speech last fall. I was still at DHS, and we were the banking and finance industry, still are actually, but they were under attack almost weekly with these DDoS events, for which they were spending literally hundreds of millions of dollars, all the different banks, even the ISPs. And sometimes I say things that are a little controversial just to see what kind of reaction I get. So I tossed out the idea of creating co-ops to aggregate resources that could then be shared amongst members of the co-op. And it was something I actually just thought about during the course of the conversation. So I didn't think it out really well, but my thinking was, so you have all these banks, big and little banks. The little banks can't afford what the big banks can, and it's very synonymous with any other sector. But what if you created some kind of a co-op where you went out and you bought bandwidth, or you went out and you bought DDoS protection services, and then you didn't need it all the time, but each week as somebody new would become under attack, they could share these resources. I think of course the feedback I got, a couple people called me an idiot and crazy and that it would never work, and maybe they're right, I don't know, but it was I still think that there's something there. And Fred, you mentioned NRECA, and that's what made me think of this, is that there is, these organizations share resources now. They share not so much infrastructure, but they share the resources. We have to figure out, because there, as you said, Chris, there's not enough people, there's not enough resources for all of us at all the time to do everything we want to do. So we have to figure out a way to scale this where within the finite universe of resources that we have, the people that need them can actually take advantage of them. I hope that made some kind of sense. I don't know.
So I just want to bring maybe a little bit of clarity to all this. One of the problems in the financial sector is they have bits, for example, that allows them to share information with each other in the security realm. But there are all sorts of problems with them sharing infrastructure, and not the least of which are technical. And there's enormous competitive potential problems as well, especially in the trading arena, which is not banks, except it is banks because they changed that regulation too. But it's in the utility space, because of the nature of utilities, they don't have the same competitive problems. The other side of that is the resources that the utilities typically need. DDoS is not the issue. It's not a matter of having lots and lots of extra bandwidth, right? This is, I just think that you have to take sort of each situation as it comes. Now, from a business standpoint, there are companies, and we'll just talk momentarily about DDoS, there are companies that specialize in DDoS protection. And so what they do is they buy lots of resources on the bet that they can share, selling this to a whole bunch of people at a reduced cost. And it's just like it used to be for disaster recovery, right? So it used to be disaster recovery. They buy some number of trucks with some number of mainframes and power supplies on them, and they'll drive them up to your place of business, and as long as everybody doesn't fail at the same time, they're pretty much good to go. So this is the shared infrastructure approach. I just want to mention the term the tragedy of the commons because that's largely what we're facing. There was, in some sense, a time when we had everybody with enough resources to carry out their own functions, and we've learned that for efficiency, it's better to share resources, but efficiency doesn't necessarily get you effectiveness. So when there's a big community event, all that efficiency that you're gaining day to day means that you can't all perform at the same time, and somebody's going to get prioritized and somebody else is going to get mad. It's a big complex space. I think there's lots you can do to improve it, but I think you have to be careful because in the competitive space, if you don't make something that's business efficient and you don't have government deciding that it's government's role to assure this and then just providing the resources out of our common pocketbooks to accomplish it, then you're always going to have these sequential situations where it's a benefit to sort of not participate. And I hate to use this as a reference, but healthcare. So healthcare, when you're young and healthy, if you don't participate, it's to your advantage. And so, there's a lot of controversy in the United States about forcing people to, pay a price when they're young and healthy. And it's not what I would call a settled issue at this point. But this is the same basic structural question that has to be addressed by a society. And I don't think that it's something that can be addressed purely by the marketplace. And I'm not a fan of regulation addressing it, but I do think that there is a role for government and governance in helping to sort of lay the groundwork for how this works. Whether it's a joint insurance process of some sort, or some aggregate extra bandwidth, or emergency mode cutovers to allow critical services to continue, or whatever, I think it has to be thought through in great depth. And one of the big problems that I think we're facing right now in terms of government and governance is the unwillingness of government to spend the time and effort to actually think through these things. And Mark, you're well aware of my thoughts on this from your time at DHS. I think that there's this notion somehow the private sector is going to show up in a meeting, once a week or once a month over the phone, and those that show up are going to, sort of write a document, and that's going to set the standard for how things are. And, what you get is camels instead of horses. And I think to be successful, you need horses. No offense to camels. They're really good in the desert.
No,
it's the feet.
That really is a good point. In fact, that with the executive order and the creation of the framework has been one of my greatest concerns, and is that you have a very select number of companies and people that are showing up at these events to write the framework, to develop the framework, and there's a lot of the vast majority of companies are not participating, and I'm afraid that someday when NIST rolls this thing out next springtime, there's a lot of companies that are going to go, what the heck is this? And so it's a challenge. I still think something needs to be done, and I think maybe this is a good first stab at it, and we'll see what comes out of it.
Well, I think we're at that time, right? And in listening to this last set of comments, I'm reflecting back on my own experience when I was a young punk, before I got to the middle-aged punk I am now. We were sitting in a room with hundreds of the best security people in the world who'd been at it for decades at that point, or a long time at least, but on my time scale. And they were all arguing basically the firewall has to be source code vetted and everything else, and every organization basically needs to spend $100,000 or more. And it dawned on me that that wasn't really possible. And we had a failure scenario. The internet won't work, period, because we can't scale up large enough to get, how is my mom going to have a firewall at home? But we did. And that sort of thing has happened over and over. And until the last year or two, and largely talking to Fred and folks like this who have been looking at this assessment identity side of things, I really haven't seen a pattern for how we do that. But we have to. We can't be sitting here 10 years from now with 99% of industrial facilities having no clue where to start, no rational basis for making decisions. So somehow we have to figure this out. And just what I know about you two and the work you do already, the comments that have been on this conversation about grouping and aggregation through industry organizations, for example, there seems to be much more clarity for myself in how we actually get this done in a time frame that is adequate to save us. So we basically have to.
Right.
And that's one of the glorious things about this. I think all said it. I am a capitalist entrepreneur, left, right, all over the map, like the country. We're a mess, but we manage on aggregate through this sort of chaos theory approach of things to arriving at workable solutions along the way. And I've got grave concerns as well. I can pick on the NIST framework, for example, and those activities or other artifacts of the federal government. I think a lot of those issues revolve around the private sector sitting too far back on their heels and allowing either the government or, as you say, Mark, a select group of organizations to make the point for us. We have another question here. Just to throw out what we've got. Check the clock here. I think about 10 minutes left before Debbie will dance us out of the room. But from Frank, and I'll just read this verbatim and take comments. While most of the discussion is on cybersecurity, it's essential that we address operational infrastructure resilience, not just how to protect, but how to maintain operations and/or rapid restore. I think that there is also need to be an expectation from the public that critical infrastructure will make the investments in this space even if it passes through tax. There should be minimum standards and procedures tied to SARA and other programs that are actually enforceable. I also think the model for resilience must account for cyber, PNT loss, natural disasters, internal error, or physical equipment failure. And Frank is an interesting perspective on all this with depths of experience like you guys. He's all much more than I do. But it's a good statement on the breadth and complexity of this.
So Chris, you're well aware that I think that we should be designing things to allow for simple, if inefficient, solutions to continuity. And this is sort of exemplified. So before Y2K, there were meetings about what happens if all the computers all screw up, whatever it is. And it's not that anybody believed that they would, but the question is, what if? And so at one of the meetings in the power industry, because we had been doing studies of this at Sandia in the previous years and trying to understand what to do here, what I suggested, and I think ultimately it was sort of adopted, was, so look, if everything goes down, and it's after midnight, or in fact if it's any time, and everything goes down, and you should have some simple instructions for your linemen. The power's out. First thing they do is try to call in. If you can't reach anybody, you go to the nearest substation. If the power is working, good. If the power is not working, and you have power incoming and no power outgoing, turn it from auto to on, and then it will work. And if there's no power incoming, wait. And what will then happen, if that's the entire rule, then it turns out that you'll be able to restore power. And it won't take that long before you have some level of power distributed to 80, 90% of everything out there. And because what happens is, in the aggregate, the set of people doing these things will get most of it functioning. And then once that much is functioning, you'll be able to get, telecommunications working and coordinate the rest of the response. And forgetting the particulars of that, the notion of it is that if you're thinking through this properly and if you're designing this stuff properly, you should have a method for restoration that's fairly direct and fairly simple. And now you'll hear the nightmare scenarios, especially in power, of some sequence of events that blow out the transformers. In fact, we saw a movie on whatever the Fear channel was right after Doomsday Preppers, showing us, electric utility poles instantly catching a blaze in fire as the transformer exploded and the whole thing caught fire, and one after another all across the city. And so I participated in some of the work on this, and I'm just going to tell you, in case you believe that that was true, not really. What they described can't really happen. But they also had people who were in elevators who couldn't open the inner door on the elevator to get out, and who decided to go up on the top of the elevator and try to jump to somewhere else, and instead ended up falling down the shaft. And people after 5 days or 8 days of no power and no water, who were still walking around talking to each other, when after 48 hours or so of no water, you're out of it. So, forgetting the fear factor, I think that rational, thorough process, well thought out and well coordinated, can get us to a situation where we know how to recover to some reasonable extent, disabling most of the information technology if we need to in order to get it there. So we need emergency modes that work reasonably well. And then we need to be able to carry out that plan and practice it to where we can survive and then build it back up. People forget that there are 1 million workers in the United States who are capable of responding and doing physical things on their own with the knowledge and expertise of how the systems actually work. And the assumption that it all falls over and everybody stands there with their hands on their hips saying, oh my God, I don't know what to do, is ridiculous. Because we have hundreds of thousands of engineers and millions of workers who will figure something out. What we want to do is figure a lot of it out in advance and practice it so we get good at it instead of waiting until the bad things happen.
Fred, you're my hero. That's one of the that was perfect. That one of the things that, especially in power, especially in electricity, people, there's so much hyperbole around this, and when in fact anybody who knows anything about electricity realizes that, you can always go to manual mode on you can almost generate electricity without the automation overlay in many cases. And, you may not be able to do the marketing, you may not be able to make any money off of it, but you can still crank out power. And it may take a week, it may take a few days to do it, but there's plenty enough smart people that are going to figure this out. I mean, just look at the natural disasters that happen. And I'm going to get criticism now because I'm minimizing the problem here. But look at the natural disasters that happen. You have an event, a hurricane, and 7 days later, 2 weeks later, they have strung new power lines, put in new poles, and they've got power back. We have a workforce, a smart workforce that can figure this stuff out.
We're down to the last couple minutes, so I'll throw a quick comment in here. I know, we're having so much fun. But from Steve, to this point, so why did NERC, EEI, ETC come out publicly with the message coincident with the movie? I think that's, sort of to my point that I was going to make, one of the problems we have, one of the risks we have right now is, as is often the case in these sort of crux periods, most of whom we have involved are enthusiasts. And we get all worked up over the details. We're all security people, we're all invested in it. And if you want to feel like an idiot, you go tell an electrical linesman with 35 years experience that, hyperventilate and say, people could die if this happens. People die all the time. And, and these infrastructures we build are dangerous. And we have people who who nonetheless, New Orleans is sinking. We've got power outages and live wires and so forth, and they go out there and put them back together. So it's one of the things, Mark, I couldn't agree more. One of the things I find very refreshing about dealing with Fred is, despite his depth of experience in this, or maybe because of it, still understand that this is, it's not as grave. It's not as, we don't have to be perfect. Everybody doesn't have to use, quantum encryption that can dance in the head of a pin. We need to make things that people can actually do in the real world, mapping to their real environments. And Prudence had offered another comment as well that I think speaks to the same thing. Let's read this quickly. Doesn't there need to be a comprehensive mapping of the interdependencies of sectors from a communications perspective in order to create market pressures to enhance the security of each sector's operations? Which I think speaks a lot to the same type of thing. Go ahead.
There was this interdependencies issue is a whole other thing. There's a IEEE paper written, I believe it was 2002, 2003. I wish I could find it.
Bloom.
Yes, great paper. I recommend people read it. It's a discussion of the interdependencies of all of the critical infrastructure. I wanted to mention one other really quick thing. So I don't want to minimize the importance of understanding that security is something that we need to be thinking about. I mean, I agree that we have plenty of smart people, and there is I think enough resilience in the electricity sector infrastructure. It's not as fragile as a lot of people say. But last week, NERC held the second biannual GridX and had about 200 different participants from utilities around the country, and there was some big eyes with a lot of the CEOs and some of the people participating in the exercise when their organization could not respond the way they thought they could. So we can't completely minimize the impact of both the physical and cyber destruction capabilities on the grid.
Right. We need to work the issues. I'm not advocating for ignoring it. I'm advocating for rational thought and decision making and working the issues. I do want to point out, we keep hearing about power. And, you can live for a very long time without electricity, but you can't live for 48 hours without water. And so when you talk about what's really critical in terms of human life, water is the more important of those two things. And in fact, if you look at the way water works, because it's so localized, and the communities will share with each other, and there's so much, bottled water and so forth, that, we do have some reasonable amount of supply there. But I think, you need to think a little bit about how you organize and how you prioritize, and you need to work through these problems. And this is, I've been encouraging people to try to do this, for many, many years. And I think there are more ears listening as the awareness goes up. But I just think that, you just have to control the fear. And when something happens that's surprising, you need to say, well, that was surprising, but let's think through it. Let's figure out what to do about it. Let's work through more scenarios so we understand the full reasonable spectrum of what might actually happen. And let's practice, and let's get good at it. But let's not go hectic. Let's not go crazy. Let's not decide fear, which means I'll buy something that I don't need that's the wrong thing. Let's, rational decision making. So that, that's the whole point, by the way, of fearless security. That's why we created it, to get away from fear and get to rational decision making. And I very much appreciate the fact that, Mark and the Chertoff Group is trying also to, help people make rational decisions. And there are lots of us out there. I just think we need to work at it. There's one other thing that I noticed in the discussion that wasn't brought out. One of the reasons that we're overwhelmed seemingly all the time with this is that we don't have enough expertise. And you can't build it overnight, right? The educational process has to bring this up from ground zero, and it's going to take a while to adapt to the change into the information age. So that's just how it is. It took a long time before we had cars that had airbags.
I was going to talk about the talent issue, but maybe we need to have another another call, Chris, and just talk about cyber talent, because I do think that I'm actually more concerned about the lack of cyber talent than many of the other security issues that we face today.
I agree, and that's a good point to end on. The workforce development issue is enormous if, again, we're going to scale. And for everybody's purposes, I put the link for the paper that Mark had referenced in the chat box, and if you don't get a chance to click on that and see that in the meantime, give me a ping. I agree. It's the best, it's the authoritative word on interdependency. It makes it very, very clear. So I'd like to, we're sort of hard up at the bottom of our time here. Respect everybody's time. Thank you for coming. And particularly thank both Mark and Fred for their extremely valuable insight and time today. And Debbie, if you would like to perform the ritual closing, I will just pull up our membership slide there. But the last slide, I'd love to have folks who are listening to this now in the future get involved with our activities. We have these briefings the third Wednesday of every month. The second Wednesday of next month, of course, because we have holidays. Thank you.
On behalf of all of us at the ICS-ISAC, we appreciate your joining us today. We hope that you found the information of value and something that you can take and implement to further secure your industrial control systems. Our next public briefing will be held Wednesday, December 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern and feature a panel of distinguished subject matter experts presenting The Arc of History, the Inevitability of Knowledge Sharing. Other sessions will be announced in our monthly updates, on our center's website, and in our other communication vehicles. Thank you again for your participation on today's call.